What's up, everyone? Had a great workout, had a great dinner. I'm excited now to share with you the ideal age for marriage. And this is a hot topic that I see come up a lot because singles don't want to believe that they've missed the boat. They don't want to believe that they've been left out to dry, that it's too late for them. Everyone wants to live in the ideal, but we don't live in the ideal. We live in the real. So I hope you'll watch the entire video because I'm going to talk about the real world after we're done considering what the ideal age is. And I do think there is an ideal age for men and women to get married. There's a few factors that we have to consider in arriving at that age. First factor, since I am addressing Christians or at least traditionally minded people, Christians tend to want to get married earlier. Also, the age of spouses at time of marriage affects divorce rate, as does the age gaps between the spouses. And then lastly, men and women peak in their dating market value at different ages. So we're certainly going to factor that in. All right, let's talk about the first factor. Christians want to marry young. I don't think I need to go into a lot of explanation here. This is kind of obvious. Christians believe that marriage is the appropriate place for sex, children, and lifelong companionship. So it makes sense they're going to want to have that sooner rather than later. They're not going to want to unnecessarily delay that. Now, I do not support marriages between really young Christians. Might talk about that a little bit later. But nevertheless, compared to the secular world, the humanistic world, absolutely makes sense that the desired age to get married is going to be younger among Christians. So we'll factor that in to our analysis. Then age affects divorce rate. And when I say age, I'm talking about the age of the man and the woman at time of marriage. So we're going to look at a couple studies here. First one from a secular group called the Institute for Family Studies, and then an article from Focus on the Family. We'll look at a few other statistics as well. The Institute for Family Studies claims that late 20s is ideal based on studies from 2010. I'm a little surprised there aren't more recent studies on this, but nevertheless, that's where the data from this study comes from, and also the Focus on the Family study. So you can see in this graph that the divorce rate hits this low point around the late 20s, and then forms this U curve, the shape where you can see that the earlier you are, the more likely you are to get divorced, and then the older you are, the more likely you are to get divorced. So sweet spot seems to be mid to late 20s. I think the reasons for that are kind of obvious. This is kind of the sweet spot at which people are still young and malleable, not too set in their ways, still, fairly close to their prime in terms of attractiveness, but also they're old enough to have knowledge of the world, what they want, how to have healthy relationships. Again, this is just talking about averages, certainly not everyone. And then a Focus on the Family study, which is also drawing data from 2010, says that 20 to 25 is the ideal age, so much younger. And it's not surprising that Focus on the Family, which is, I believe they are a professing Christian organization, it's not surprising that they're going to keep that ideal age younger. So they're trying to promote the idea of traditional family values, the idea that people ought to get married and they ought to get married younger. I don't feel any need to back up Focus on the Family or be biased in that regard. As a Christian, I'm really interested in where the data leads. So I don't find their article as persuasive. I will note that this is they make a couple interesting admissions. So they argue that while marriages that happen at older ages may have a higher rate of survival, so basically they're acknowledging that the divorce rate is lower, kind of in accordance with this graph. They're saying that their quality is lower. Not really sure how you measure that. That seems quite subjective, but it is an interesting point, and I'm sure we could speculate on how that could possibly be the case. They also make this interesting admission, though, referring to the researcher in one of the studies, Glenn. However, unimportantly, Glenn explains that it would be premature to conclude that the optimal time for first marriage for most persons is ages 22 to 25 because other critical factors impact risk of divorce and marital happiness as well. So this is an admission that in a vacuum, 22 to 25 might be best. But in the real world, when you consider other factors, that's not the case. So I'm going to lean more toward the Institute for Family Studies. I probably agree that later 20s or toward later 20s is probably better than a lower age like 22. But anyway, you'll see my opinion on the ideal age in a bit. So let's also consider 2016 Psychology Today study suggests that 28 is the sweet spot age for marriage, as couples who marry at this age are less likely to divorce. So it's another study, more recent, backing up the Institute for Family Studies. And then here are a couple other statistics I found on the website of a law firm. They did not cite their references, so I'm going to mark this as unverified. You can get the outline for this video in the video description. Check it out if you want. So I'm pretty certain these percentages are with respect to divorce rate per 1,000 women. And again, you can go into the article to see why that is. This is considered a more accurate way to look at divorce rate. They say that divorce rates increase by 5% each year for couples who marry after age 32. So again, this seems to be backing up this data, or maybe this is even based on this data. Not 100% sure. And then they also say that couples who marry between the ages of 20 and 24 are 20% more likely to divorce than those who marry between 25 and 29. Again, backing up this graph. 20 to 24. Why is that a worse time to get married? I think the simplest reason is probably just lack of understanding of what someone actually wants in a spouse. Now, one can argue, well, this is probably considering non-Christians mostly, and Christians ought to have a better consideration of what they want in a spouse, and so, they shouldn't be hindered by such factors. In theory, yeah, I can see how that is the case. In practice, I'm not certain, though, I would actually agree with that. I think that Christians, just as much as non-Christians, can benefit tremendously from what I call exploratory dating, where they go out and date not with the express purpose of trying to figure out whether the person sitting across from them in the coffee shop is going to be their spouse, but just to learn more about who they are, what they can attract, what they're interested in. And yeah, by the time you've done a sufficient amount of exploratory dating, which, by the way, I'm not saying that anybody has to, forego what could be a great marriage because they haven't dated enough yet. I'm not saying that at all. But by the time that most people, I think, have done a sufficient amount of exploratory dating to understand what they want, they probably are going to be mid-20s, especially because in this day and age, a lot of people come out of even college just pretty clueless about the world and how to live. It's kind of frightening. And I was one of those people in certain respects. I certainly did not understand relationships and women coming out of college. All right, let's move on. So, age gaps definitely affect divorce rate. And you can, again, go explore that source I include. This is an article from a medical journal. 2 to 10 years appears to be the ideal age gap between older men and younger women. And also, the divorce rate is much higher for older women marrying younger men. And I'm going to do a series later on whether you should marry certain types of people. And in that series, I'm going to consider that dynamic and what the challenges I think are. Obviously, I'm not forbidding an older woman from marrying a younger man. That was actually described my first marriage. Nevertheless, there are some concerns there that should be considered. All right, and then men and women peak in dating market value at different ages. This is probably going to be the most sensitive and controversial part of this video, but when have I ever been a stranger to controversy? So, women tend to peak in their early 20s, and that is because a woman's dating market value is much more closely tied to her physical attractiveness exclusively, and her ability to bear children than a man. Also, to some extent, younger women tend to be more, this is very general, I would say they tend to be more malleable, which can have benefits in a marriage with the proper dynamic. But also, some might make the argument that younger women tend to be more submissive, which, again, depending on the marriage dynamic, can be beneficial. But most of this does boil down to sexual attractiveness and ability to bear children. So that's why a woman's sexual I don't like the term sexual market value. That's kind of a cringy red pill term. I like the term dating market value. Their dating market value tends to peak in their early 20s. Then men, I would say this is, if you're just considering the average, is mid to late 20s. But the reality is that the relevance of this is probably debatable, because I don't think a man's dating market value is as heavily tied to age. I'm kind of an example of that. I'm not going to go into story time, but let me just tell you that if you're a man who has worked to look good for his age or look younger than his age, and is financially secure or well off and knows how to have good conversations with younger women, yeah, the age gap issue just really isn't there. When we hear about women strongly not wanting to date men that are a lot older than them, a lot of times that's just because they view older men as much less attractive or whatever. But some of those things can be mitigated, and so I don't think a man's DMV is as heavily tied to age. Hence why, yeah, even as we saw up here, 10 years, that's considered an age gap, a large age gap relationship. 10 plus is considered a large age gap in a marriage. And this medical journal was saying that even a large age gap relationship can produce a low divorce rate. And one video I was kind of referencing as I was studying this was an interesting debate between a researcher named Mack and Murphy, who I would consider black-pilled, basically meaning that he's going to put a lot more emphasis on looks with regards to his attraction theory. And he was debating Richard Cooper, who's a well-known manosphere figure, very red pilled. And so he's going to put a lot more emphasis on self improvement. Doing the work is a term that Richard Cooper uses a lot. And it was an interesting debate because I think it shows the difference between kind of anecdotes, personal anecdotes in the real world versus just taking scientific statistics and trying to weigh in on the debate. So I actually come out on this, even though I am personally more black pilled than red pilled. I do think that the red pilled gentleman in that debate came out on top. I'm going to do a reaction video to that at some point in the future, so I think it's very interesting. All that being said, I guess the reason I'm mentioning this is that, tying back into this, a man's DMV is not as heavily tied to age as I think some black pillars want to think it is. So, when I say here men tend to peak in their mid to late 20s, I mean, we're really talking about the ideal. We're definitely not talking about what frequently happens in the real world. In the real world, there's no shortage of guys in their mid to late 20s who just have very little going for them. And then if they put in the work, they can be quite attractive or high value in their 30s. All right, so putting it all together, here's my opinion. On average, the ideal age for marriage for a man is probably 25 to 28. And the ideal age for marriage for a woman is probably 22 to 25. So this is going to consider all those factors, just the best age to get married at, the appropriate age gap, the fact that Christians tend to want to get married a little bit younger, and then also considering the fact that men want to marry women in their early or mid 20s. So if you asked me to create the perfect couple purely from the standpoint of their ages, I would probably take and again, we're talking about Christians here, I would probably take a Christian man who is 26 or 27 and put him with a Christian woman who is 22 or 23, maybe even 21. But that's the ideal, and we don't live in the ideal. In reality, here is the ideal age for you to get married. The ideal age for you to get married is when you're physically, emotionally, financially, and spiritually ready to get married. And being ready in these ways should supersede any concerns about age. So if you took that perfect couple age-wise that I mentioned earlier, and they're not ready in the ways I've just described, and you wanted me to stack them up against someone who, a couple who's much older or even younger and is ready in those ways, well, obviously I'm always going to bet on the latter couple. Age is a factor in considering divorce rates, considering marital health, but it is by no means the only factor. It is by no means the most important factor. I'd kind of like it if you're at this age where you can still hit the ideal and you're trusting in that. I mean, I'd say that's foolish. You need to be looking at these other factors first and foremost. And if you happen to get married at this ideal age, it's almost coincidental. That's great. Good for you. Lucky in a sense. Again, I don't believe in luck, but you know what I mean. Just not significant. It's kind of like the people who think, well, I married a virgin, so I'm good. No, if you're trusting in your virginity or your spouse's virginity to have a healthy marriage, to divorce proof your marriage, then you're just a fool. All right. So I don't want anyone to despair at all after watching this video. I mean, I'm a guy in his late 30s who's looking to get married again. I did, by the way, for my first marriage. I got married during the ideal time. I was 27. But what you need to do, no matter where you are in life, is focus on being financially, emotionally, financially, and spiritually ready. Financially is admittedly more for men than women. I think men financially having their ducks in a row is much more important than women. But if you have your act together in these ways, you're going to have options at any stage of life. You really are. So don't worry about the fact that you've missed the boat, so to speak, age-wise. Again, see a lot of people doing that, especially women who are in their 30s. They're scared, they're frustrated. Look, focus on self-improvement. Focus on these areas you can control. You can't control your age. So apart from being focused on self-improvement, per my dating strategy guide, also be in a place where you're valued and cast a wide net. You do those three things and you're very, very likely, there's no promise that you're going to get married, but you're very, very likely, I think, to maximize your chances of having a marriage that you want. So personally, I am 39, as I mentioned, but I'm very focused on self-improvement in all areas of my life, and my dating life has benefited tremendously as a result. So in the description of this video, you can see my self-improvement guide. And I also am going to be doing an upcoming series on self-improvement. So hope you'll subscribe, stick around for that. Also, please like this video, please comment. I'd love to hear your questions or thoughts. And then also, if you're interested in doing dating or self-improvement coaching with me, you can go down in the description, check out my intake form or ways to contact me. So hope you found this video useful, and I'll see you in the next one.